Hey patrons, welcome back to another tutorial series, and in this one we are going to be working in coloured pencil, and a lot of you have been requesting to see more beginner tutorial series, so coloured pencil series that are aimed at beginners and go through the basics a bit more. So in this series I'm going to just be focusing on going through the basic techniques such as layering, blending with solvent, adding details and all of that stuff, and I'm going to be going through the materials that I use for the coloured pencil drawings. And whilst I'm doing that, we're going to be drawing this cupcake so that you can see all of the basic techniques in action to come up with the final drawing. So I think this will be good for those of you that are beginners and want to hear a bit more about how I do my basic techniques in more detail. So I'll just be focusing on that as we go through this drawing. And I'm going to be splitting it up into 4 parts, so this is going to be a 4-part series. In this first part, I'm just going to be focusing on going through the materials that I use, the properties I look for in my materials. So for example, what I look for in the paper I'm using, the coloured pencils and the colours. I'll go through the colours that I'm going to use. I'll be going through what I'll be using to blend and the supplies I'll be using to blend out this drawing. And yeah, that's going to be the first part. And then in the second part, I'm going to be going through my layering techniques. So how you build up that first layer of coloured pencil and how to get in the shadows and your values accurate, and how to get nice light shading and how to transition between colours really nice and soft. And then in the third part, we're going to be blending all of this out. So we'll be blending out the first layer. And then in the final part, we'll be adding the details, our second layer, and also we'll be adding highlights as well. So let's go through the materials that I'll be using throughout this tutorial series. Okay, so let's start off by talking about the paper that I use for my coloured pencil drawings. So as many of you may know, I use solvent quite a lot to blend out my coloured pencil, especially if I'm drawing something like an animal study or objects. It's only really portraits where I don't use the solvent technique because I find the burnishing technique easier for portrait drawings. But when I'm drawing animals or objects, I like to use a solvent. Now the one I'm using is the Zest-It pencil blend, but for solvent you can use paint thinners, anything really like an odourless mineral spirit would be good. Paint thinner if you can't get your hands on this, even something like Gamsol, or if you just want to practice to see if this technique is something that you like, then I've found even stuff like nail polish remover, even though it's not the most archival thing, it's good for you to practice just on a scrap piece of paper to see if you like the technique, because it works very similar to the normal solvents, how they work. But back to paper, I like to use the Archer's hot pressed watercolour paper, and that is what I'm using for the cupcake drawing that we will be doing. And this is the £140 watercolour paper, so it's quite thick and sturdy. And the reason I like to use watercolour paper for this particular type of coloured pencil drawing is because we are using solvent. And solvent is a wet medium, so you want a paper that's able to handle a wet medium put on top of it. So watercolour paper is really good, and I also find that it's a really good paper for actually layering because it holds a lot of the coloured pencil. Whereas if you was to use a really smooth, slick paper, the solvent wouldn't really be able to sink in and work properly. It would just sort of lay on top as a film. And with a really smooth paper, you can't do a lot of layering. And with the solvent technique, we do add quite a few layers. So you don't have to use this exact watercolour paper. You can use any watercolour paper that you want. I do recommend hot press because it is a lot smoother, whereas the cold press has got more of a texture to it, a rougher texture, and so your coloured pencil drawing might not be as smooth. But the hot pressed is really good. Like I said, you don't have to use this exact one because it is quite expensive. So that is the paper I'm using. Though if you are using the burnishing technique, I do use this paper. So even though I won't be using the burnishing technique in this tutorial series, I'll still give you guys a recommendation for what I use when I do use that other technique, when I'm not using solvent. So I use the Strathmore Bristol Smooth Surface Paper. This is again quite thick, £100, and it is really cheap. This is their 300 series, so it is very affordable and it's really good quality. It is a smooth surface paper, which means it has got that really nice slick surface, which makes it really good if you're drawing portraits and you're using the burnishing technique. Because it is so smooth, you can do really smooth blending and shading. But like I said, smooth papers don't take as much coloured pencil because they're very smooth. They haven't got a lot of texture and tooth to grip onto a lot of coloured pencil. So this is when you want to do stuff where you're not going to be doing too many layers. For example, when I'm drawing animals and I'm doing fur, I like to do a lot of layers to get that fur texture. But if I'm doing skin, I won't be doing as much layering because I'm not trying to get as much texture in. So again, that's a very good, very affordable paper. So now that you've got the paper sorted, again, it's just really something like a watercolour paper for this. Hot pressed would be better, but you can use any sort of paper that's not got a really smooth texture and is good for adding a wet medium on top. You can even use that Strathmore Bristol vellum surface, which is a slightly rougher, more textured surface than the smooth. I have used solvent on that before and it works really well. So for the solvent, I've gone through that I'll be using the Zest It pencil blend, but you can use any type of solvent, paint thinner, odorless mineral spirit, stuff like that. And to blend out with, I'll be using cotton buds or Q-tips if you're in America. So I'll be using these because these are really good at getting into those little detailed areas. And they're very cheap, you might have them already around the house. And for large areas, I will be using this brush. Now, when you're using solvent, you will want to use quite a strong, sturdy brush. So I'm using this Filbert brush and it is a Daler Rowney brush. And this, again, was very cheap. It's not an expensive brush at all. And you don't really need an expensive brush. And this is the size 12, but you can get them in different sizes so that you can get into smaller areas or even larger ones to do big areas. So I'll be using this mainly for doing the frosting, for blending out those larger areas. Okay, so the next supply that I've got is just a larger fluffy brush. You can use any type of clean brush for this. Fluffy brushes are better. And I simply just use this tool to wipe away any coloured pencil bits that get on my paper when I'm doing my shading. So sometimes you'll get little coloured pencil crumbs on there, and instead of wiping them away and smudging and getting oils on your paper, I just use a brush to get rid of these. And it makes it a lot cleaner doing it this way. Especially if you've already got solvent on your paper, you don't want to smear anything. Another supply that I'll be using is this kneaded eraser, and I simply just use this at the start of the drawing to lighten up my sketch outline. As you can see, I've already got the sketch down for the cupcake, and I just used a normal regular HB pencil for this, and I have attached the sketch outline so you can use mine and also the reference image so that you guys can follow along with this tutorial series. But normally I do it a little bit darker than I want it to be once I start to add coloured pencil. So I do go over with a kneaded eraser when I draw each area just to lighten up the sketch so that it doesn't peek through any of the coloured pencils. Now let's talk about the different colours that I'll be using throughout this piece. I'm going to be using my Prismacolor coloured pencils for this, but you don't have to use them. You can use your Polychromos, Caran d'Ache, whatever you have, you can use them. And I have got a little list of the colours that I'll be using. Before I start each drawing, I do test the colours and I write down which colours I'll be using for each section of my drawing. So for the cherry, for example, I seen that there was highlighted areas and then you got this shadowed area for the cherry as well. So I picked colours that would match the highlighted area and then some to mix together to make the darker tone. And you don't have to have one perfect colour for each area. If you can't find the perfect colour, you may need to mix a few together to get a colour that is closer to the reference. But also remember, you don't have to have your colours exactly the same as the reference. It can still look very realistic if your colours are slightly different. What's more important is that you get your values correct and the contrast correct throughout the drawing. So it doesn't matter if you get the perfect shade of red, it's just important that you've got a lighter red and then a darker red to have that difference in value, which will make the drawing pop. So don't worry if you have a limited colour palette, if you only have a few coloured pencils, you can do something really realistic as long as you have different values. So even if you had a red tone but then you didn't have a dark red, you could mix the red for the highlighted areas and then a red mixed with a bit of brown to get a slightly darker version of red for the rest of the cherry. Now I want to go through the colours that I will be using for this cupcake drawing. And I wrote them down because I'll be using the same colours throughout for different areas, so just so that it's easier for me to go through it with you guys. Let's start with the cherry. For the cherry, I will be working on this drawing from the top to the bottom when I do the layering, and this will help to prevent smudging because it just will. And for the cherry, I'll be using magenta. And the magenta will be for the highlighted areas because in the reference it's a very pinky red tone. So magenta is going to be for the highlights in the cherry. Then for the darker shadows, I'll be mixing two colours together to make that darker rich red tone. So I'll be mixing the crimson red, which you can see is a much darker deep red tone, and then the Tuscan red, which is a bit darker, a bit more brown toned. So mixing them together will create the really nice, accurate, rich red that we need, and that pinky red will make a great highlighted colour. So I'm just going to be using those three colours for the cherry. Now for the frosting, which is the large proportion of this drawing, you can see that it is a pink tone, but it's a bit more like a baby pink. It's not much of a red toned pink frosting, even though we've got the pinkish red cherry, the pink frosting, and then the pink cupcake case. Each of them are a different type of pink, so I needed different colours. So for the base layer for the frosting, for that really light pink tone, I'll be using the pink rose. And this is a really nice baby pink colour, and I found that this one matched the closest. It's not the exact match, but it's close enough. So we'll be using the pink rose for the majority of the frosting. And then I've also got this carmine red. So this is a very fluorescent pinky red tone, and you can see in the reference that for some of the shadows you've got this very saturated red tone by the shadows, so I thought that would make a good colour for that area. And then again I'll be using that Tuscan red for the shadows in the frosting, just like we are doing for the shadows in the cherry. Okay, now for the cake sponge. So I'm only using three colours for this. I'm using the yellow ochre for the base tone, and then to darken up the shadows I've got the sienna brown, which is a nice warm brown tone. I didn't want a brown that was too dull. I wanted a nice orangey warm toned brown, so this made a perfect colour in combination with that yellow ochre. And then for the darkest shadows I will be adding a hint of dark brown, especially at the bottom of that cake sponge where it meets with the casing where it's very shadowed. So again, just three colours. I'm not using loads of colours for each area. Now for these little, I don't know what to call them, wafer straws, you can see that it's pretty much white and brown. But even the white areas aren't 100% white. They've got a lot of shadow either side, and then they're lighter in the middle. So again, we'll need to have colours to do the shading on those shadowed areas, even though they're white. So for the brown parts, again, I'll be using the dark brown. And then for the whitish areas, I'll be using the 10% French grey, which is a very, very off-white, light grey colour. And then you can see that on the side of the white, it's got a very faint brown tinge to it in the reference. So again, I'm going to be using the sienna brown just to add that slight brown tinge. Okay, now moving on to the casing. So the casing is a very bright pink tone. It's a lot brighter than the frosting and it's more pink than the cherry. The cherry is more of a red tone. So for the main part of the casing, I'm going to be using the Process Red, which is a very hot pink colour. I'll also be using a bit of magenta because in the shadowed areas, it's a little more of a reddish pink for the shadows. And then for the shadows, for those darker areas, I'll be using the dark purple to get in the shading in between the little folds of the paper casing. And last but not least, the bow. The bow is this very bright turquoise colour, and I really like this reference because it's got a lot of different colours in it, and I just thought it would be good because we've got different sort of textures to get in. We've got really shiny fabric, we've got the frosting and these paper folds. So I thought this would be a good one for us to go through. And I'm just going to be using two colours for this. I'm going to be using the light aqua for the main part of the bow, and then just to darken up some of the shadows, I'll be using the 70% warm grey. Now, if I had the 70% cold grey, I'd be using that, but I couldn't find it, so I tested the 70% warm grey and it worked fine. So I'm going to mix those together to create the shadows. Now, as well as those colours, I'll also be using black and white. Not very much, but I'll be using the white to create highlights or add in highlights after we've blended out with the solvent, and the black if I need to darken up any areas and make it really dark, particularly at the bottom of the cake base where it meets with the paper casing. And I couldn't find the Prismacolor black, so I'm just using the Crayola black, which goes to show you that you don't need to use super expensive coloured pencils to get started with this. Especially when you're using solvent, the solvent really makes the colours nice and vibrant. But that is all the colours that I'll be using. Remember, you don't have to have those exact colours, just go for the closest matches that you have. It's more about your values than having the perfect shade. So if you have a brown, if you have a red and a pink and these purples and something like a yellow tone, you could even do this with the basic set of Crayola coloured pencils, even if you just have, you know, one of each colour, because you can always use the brown to mix in to darken things up, or the black if you really need to. So that is the coloured pencils that we'll be using. I think I've now gone through all of the different materials that you'll need. I can't think of anything else. I'm just looking around. Oh, one more thing. For the brightest highlights, I will just be adding a couple of little highlights in with my white gel pen, just to get in the most opaque, brightest highlights, particularly these little shiny areas on the cherry that you can see maybe on these little balls. For the balls as well, I'll just be using a bit of 10% French grey to get in some of the shadows, but the majority of the balls are quite white. But that is it for the materials. Now that we're all set and all ready to go, remember you can use the sketch outline to get that down on your paper. For those of you that have been asking me how you can do that, you can simply trace the sketch and transfer it onto your paper by using tracing paper, or you can print off the sketch and have it alongside your paper, and you can try and freehand my sketch if you want and do it yourself. It's up to you how you do that. You can either directly transfer it if you want to focus on the coloured pencil techniques in this series, or if you want to focus on your drawing skills as well, you can use my sketch as guidance, because you may want to use it to see which lines I did sketch out, and you could potentially do the grid method on both of them. And if you don't want to print anything out, you could hold your paper on top of the monitor if you have like a computer and trace it through there. It's up to you, but that is it for this part. We've gone through all of the materials, and in the second part we're going to be starting this drawing and we're going to be working on the layering process. So I'll see you guys in part 2. Bye everybody. Hey patrons, welcome back to part 2 in this tutorial series. In part 1 we were focusing on going through the materials that you will need to tackle this tutorial series. I went through the different colours that I'll be using, the solvent I'll be using, as well as some tips for picking the paper for this project. And now we're going to start the layering process. I'll be working from the top to the bottom of the drawing, which means that I'll be starting with the cherry. And I'm going to start off by using my kneaded eraser to lightly lift up the sketch for the cherry first, so that when we add our coloured pencils, we don't see the graphite sketch showing through. So you want to make this as light as possible while still being able to see it. So we want to be able to vaguely see the sketch, but we don't want any excess graphite there, which will make it easy for the graphite to peek through the coloured pencil layers on top of it. So you can dab the kneaded eraser or sweep it across. Sweeping the kneaded eraser removes more of the graphite, whereas dabbing removes it a lot more gradually. And I'm just removing the sketch outline for the cherry to start off with. And we're going to start off by working on the shadows. And like I said in part 1, I'll be using the Crimson Lake and the Tuscan Red, so these two Prismacolors, to go in and getting the shadows. And then for the highlights, I'll be using the magenta. But we're going to focus on the shadows first, so I don't need the magenta at the moment. And I'm going to use the Crimson Lake to start to shade in where the shadows on this cherry are. So we'll work from the top, and I'm going to go in little circular motions as I do this, and I'm going to be very light as I do this as well. Don't worry if it's looking a little grainy, because that is where the solvent comes into it. The solvent gets rid of all of the graininess and gives a really smooth finish. So I am going in little lines as I do the stalk, feathering my pencil downwards. And you can see that I missed out this area here because it's slightly more highlighted, so we can use the magenta to get in that area. So now let's move on to the cherry, and in my sketch outline you can see that I've sketched out where the shadows are and then where the highlighted sections are, which makes it very easy to know where you need to shade. So if you're unsure, you can always look at my sketch outline, which I've attached for you guys, and see where I have sketched out the different highlighted areas. When I'm doing this large area, I'm again switching over to using circular motions. And I am holding my pencil a little further back, which helps to make my shading nice and light and very even. Whereas if you hold it a lot closer, you're more likely to get an uneven shading and to get stubborn pencil marks showing through, which will be harder to blend out later on. So it's a lot easier and you'll get a much better result if you keep everything nice and light. Carefully working my way around the highlighted areas. And you can occasionally rotate your pencil to keep it sharper for longer. So you may see that every few seconds I'll start to rotate my pencil. And that means that you don't have to sharpen it as much, which means that you get a lot more use out of your pencils. Especially the Prismacolors, as they wear down a bit easier than something like the polychromos do, because they are a lot softer. They've got a softer core. Making sure to get a nice clean edge to the cherry. And don't try and press super hard because you want to get it darker, because the solvent darkens everything up as well, and we'll also be using the Tuscan Red in a minute to darken this up further. So this will look a lot darker once we add in the solvent. And if it's not dark enough, we can always add in more layers over the top once we've blended with the solvent. Looking around to see if I need to shade in any other areas. I'm happy with how that looks. Now let's move on to using the Tuscan Red and just add another layer with this pencil to darken it all up further. Once again, going in circular motions and keeping a very light hand. And we're just overlapping all of the areas where we added in that crimson lake. And as you start to add more layers anyway, it starts to become smoother as you're filling in more of the white grain of the paper, so you get a much smoother result. Let's fill in the stalk. And keep working your way around the cherry until you've added a layer of Tuscan Red over the whole of the shadowed areas. Nearly finished, and then we'll be moving on to filling in those highlighted areas with the magenta. You can build up more layers without applying any more pressure by switching the direction that you're shading in, as this will allow the pencil to grip the dips and valleys of the paper that the pencil hasn't got to already, because you're approaching it from a different angle, which will again darken up the shadows even more. Okay, now let's switch over to the magenta, and we're going to fill it in those highlighted areas. Starting with this highlight on the stalk. Being very light as I do this. And I'm just going to add more and more layers of magenta where the darkest parts of those highlights are. And then once we've added the solvent and blended this out, we can add the little bright highlights. We can add highlights with the gel pen, and we can just make this look glossier. This is just the base layer for now. I'm quickly going to switch back over to the Tuscan Red and just clean up the edge of the cherry a bit more. Okay, so now that we've worked on the cherry, it's time to move a bit further down and we'll work on these little straws, these little wafer straws. And for that, we'll need the dark brown. We'll also need the 10% French grey, so a light grey, a dark brown, and also this warm brown tone, this sienna brown. And we're going to start off by blocking in the darkest areas first. So I'm going to go in and create the brown stripes by lightly shading in the dark brown. I'll also use the kneaded eraser just to lighten up the sketch outline. There we go, just so that the graphite don't peep through, because if it does, it will give it more of a cartoony look. If you can see harsh outlines peeping through the coloured pencil, it gets rid of the nice realistic illusion and makes it look more cartoony. Which is also why you want to avoid outlining at all in your coloured pencil drawings. You want to avoid doing any harsh outlines unless areas are overlapping each other. I'm going to get in the brown on both of the straws. Going in circular motions to fill in most of the tooth of the paper. I'm going to go over them once again to make them nice and dark. Okay, now let's switch over to using the 10% French grey, and I'm going to shade this vertically on both of the sides of the straw, leaving that white highlight in the centre. I'm going to do that on both of the straws. And then to add more of that browny tone, I'm going to go in with that sienna brown and just lightly add a little bit of this over the top of those shadowed areas. Over the top of the shadowed areas within the white sections. I'm even going to layer it a little bit over that dark brown to tie everything in together. Once again, going to shade over that with the 10% French grey. Add a little bit of it this side. And I'm going to go back in quickly with the dark brown and just go over the straws, the dark sections of the straws. Remember, it will become darker and richer when we blend it out using the solvent. Now let's move on to the cupcake frosting. We'll be using the pink rose for this, the carmine red, and also the Tuscan red as well. So once again, we'll be using the kneaded eraser to lighten up the sketch. I'm going to use my brush just to remove the bits of coloured pencil from those little straws. And so let's lighten up this sketch. I'm lightening up the sketch for the whole of the frosting. And I'm tapping my kneaded eraser quite firmly over the sketch. I find doing this dabbing motion the safest, as you are lifting up the graphite a lot more gradually. It may take a little longer to do, but you won't run the risk of losing your sketch and lifting up too much. Okay, I'm going to keep going over it until it's as light as possible while still being able to see it. That's what you're looking for. You want it to be as light as possible but still able to see it. Especially where the lightest shading is. So you can get away with the sketch being a little bit darker where the shadows are, for example, but where the highlighted areas are, so for the lightest parts of the frosting, you want to make sure that it really is nice and light, otherwise you'll see it peeping through those areas of really light shading. Okay, so now that I've done that, like I said, we'll be using the pink rose, the Tuscan red and the carmine red. And I'm going to start by adding in a light layer of the pink rose throughout the frosting, working from the top to the bottom. Actually, I think it would be best to work on it section at a time. First adding in this layer of shading with the pink rose and then adding in the shadows before moving on to the next section. I'm also going around the balls. We don't want to shade the balls in pink because they are this white tone. So because this is a beginner tutorial, I will be showing you a few different methods that you can use. Firstly, you can use this method where you go in and work from light to dark. So you work on the lightest first and then you start to add in the shadows. I'm using the Tuscan red to do this. You start to lightly shade in the shadows, making sure you're easing into the shadows by going nice and light and then adding more shading right where the shadow is the darkest. Or in a minute I'll show you the other method where you can start with the shadows and then glaze over the top the lightest colours. I'm really looking at the reference to see how the shadows are curving, how wide the shadows are. Because I think this method where you add the pink rose on top, because it's covering the sketch outline, we can't really see where the shadows are meant to be. So it's probably more useful to do the shadows first. So I'll show you that technique in a minute and then you can see which one you preferred. Add a bit of shadow under the ball. So now I'm going to add a bit more shading where the darkest areas of the frosting are, the darkest shadows. I want to make this really stand out, so I want to have a nice contrast, which means I want to make sure I'm getting my shadows as dark as they need to be. Plus, in order to blend with solvent, you definitely need to have enough pigment down for the solvent to be able to blend out. So even if you've got areas that are really light, try and lay down some white where your highlights are, your brightest highlights, so that it still blends out nice and smoothly. Once again, I'm going to go in with another layer of the pink rose. And I'm going to go in with the carmine red and just glaze this wherever that brighter reddish pink tone is on top of the shadows. This will just make it look more vibrant and make it stand out more. And you'll want to make sure that you're using all three of these colours throughout the frosting so that it all ties in together and looks nice and cohesive. Also, let's do the ball whilst we're working our way from the top to the bottom. So I'm just going to go around it with the pink rose to give it a really nice shape. And then I'm going to go in with the French Grey 10% and just use this to shade in where the darkest part of that ball is. Mainly at the bottom. I am using a bit of pressure to get the French Grey to show up. And then I'm even going to mix in a little bit of the pink rose, just at the bottom. There's only a little bit of shading on these small balls. And that's it. I'm just going to add a bit of the Tuscan red, just to clean up the edge of the ball at the bottom. But that's enough to make it look nice and realistic. Now let's carry on further down and I'll show you the second method where I'm going in with the Tuscan red first to establish the shadows. So let's start here and I'm just going to be very light when I'm shading this. Now it's easier to see where the shadows are because we haven't added any coloured pencil on top of the sketch outline yet. And the more you practice using your coloured pencils, the more you'll get to grips with how light the sketch outline needs to be. All I'm doing at the moment is just getting in these shadows, focusing on getting in the structure for the frosting, looking at how the shadows swirl around, where the darkest part of each shadow is. And I'm looking to see where I need to transition out of the shadow by easing off the pressure. So we need to bring the shadow a little further down here, but the darkest part of the shadow is a little bit above that area. Need to darken up around this section. And once you figure out which one of these methods you like best, pick that method and stick to it, otherwise the drawing might not look cohesive throughout if you're using different techniques. I just wanted to show you both and then I'll decide which one I think looks the best. So we've got another little ball here. You can only see a little bit of it though. I'm going to keep working my way further down. Once again, easing out of that shadow by being really light with my pressure as I get further away from where the darkest part of the shadow is. Okay, I'm just going to work my way across this section and then we'll start to add in the other colours. If you're unsure where the darkest parts of the frosting are, it may be easier for you to convert the reference to black and white because that makes it easier to judge the values because it's all in grayscale. So that's a tip for you guys. If you want to compare the values easier throughout a coloured pencil piece, especially if it's different colours, then turn them both to black and white, your drawing and the reference, if you take a photo of your drawing, and see where you need to go darker. Compare each area. It will help you also establish where the darkest values are within your reference. Once again, don't worry if anything's looking a bit grainy, it's supposed to. So now I'm going back throughout that area that I've just shaded in. I'm looking for the darkest shadows, just adding a bit more layering of the Tuscan red to those areas. I'm also looking throughout the whole of the section and seeing if I've missed any areas where there are some shadows, even if they are more subtle. It's important to get them in. Just spend a couple more minutes just making sure you're happy with your shadows. If you need to, you can always go in with a little bit of dark brown to darken up some of the darkest shadows even more. There's just this one or two shadows here that I just want to darken up a bit more. Just that pop of dark brown and even potentially a little bit of black, maybe what you need just to make it look really accurate. And so now that we've got in all of those shadows, we can start to work on adding in the pink rose now. And I'm just going to layer that over the frosting. I'm going to miss out some of the major highlighted areas that are really white, and we can add white over the top of them. Because even though it's important to get in all of your darkest areas, it's just as important to make sure that you're preserving the highlights. So you don't need to add the pink rose everywhere. And I am layering it over the top of the shadows to tie those areas in together. Again, there's a highlight in the middle of this section, so I'm not going to add any pink rose there. I'm going to go around the ball. We'll fill that in a minute. And we will be going in with the carmine red in a minute as well, to make it look nice and vibrant and saturated. Okay, I'm looking around, seeing if I need to layer any more of the pink rose anywhere. I'm particularly looking at all of the areas I've left for white to see if I've left any of them white by accident. So now I'm going to go in with the carmine red and start to build up some of this colour throughout the shadows to give a lot more saturation to the frosting. Lightly going over the shadowed areas, and it helps to transition those shadows into the highlights, into the pink rose. Just go throughout all of the shadows and layer some of this over the top. Again, be very nice and gentle, light hand as you do this. And any areas that look a little more saturated, just add a little bit of this. So now you can decide which of those methods you preferred. And then you can repeat that method throughout the rest of the piece. For me, I preferred that second method where I added in the shadows first, so that's the one I'll be using. Okay, now let's move back to those little balls, and I'm going to start to add in some of the French grey 10%, where the darkest parts of those balls are. Mainly again at the bottom, and I'm going to do the same with this other one. All of the shadows are pretty much on the bottom half of the ball. Again, pressing quite hard to do this, and I'm going to go in with that pink rose and just layer that a little bit over the balls as well, because they have got that pink tinge to them throughout those shadowed areas. We can use the white gel pen later on to add in any highlights that we need to. And I'm just going to use the Tuscan red just to darken up underneath these balls to add in that little bit of shadow. I'm looking to see where the shadow is. For example, on this ball it was slightly to the side. And I'm going to look throughout the shadows, and I'm just going to add a bit more Tuscan red to darken up any areas throughout the section that we've just done, any areas that need to go a bit darker. You want to make sure that you've got your shadows as dark as they need to be. In comparison to the highlights, I mean it will go darker once we add the solvent. But we want to make sure there's a good contrast there. Okay, now I'm going to work my way throughout the rest of the icing, throughout the rest of this frosting, and I'm going to repeat the process of getting in these darkest shadows first. And as we get towards the bottom, these I don't know, swirls of frosting become bigger. So there's not as much shadow. Make sure that when you're shading in the shadows that you've checked it with the reference and you're sure that is where the shadow is. You can always remove some of the coloured pencil with an eraser if you need to. I'm just sketching out where the shadows are, and then I'll thicken them up in a minute. Because the sketch outline is very light, it's sometimes easier to sketch out the edges of the frosting swirls first, and then go in and add the shading, just so that we don't lose them. Now I'm lightly shading in the shadows, adding a light layer to start off with, throughout where this shadow is, and then I'm going to go in and add additional layers for the darkest points of that shadow, directly into the fold of icing, so that we've got that nice transition now. Also, under the frosting where it meets the cake base, you can use the dark brown to get in those shadows. I'll do that in a minute. The dark brown. Because remember, you don't want any outlines, you just want soft value changes. So we do want to get rid of all of these little outlines that we've drawn. Make sure you want to ease out of those outlines so that it becomes a nice soft value change. And that's the key to making your drawings look realistic, is that your value changes are nice and soft. Even if the shadow is really light, still add the Tuscan red, just make it really light shading. I'm just going to continue to get in these shadows. It's just the same process as before. And I hope you're starting to get to grips with the layering process. Again, remember to go in small circular motions, hold the pencil nice and far back. That will make it so much easier to get smooth shading. I'm going to add a bit of shadow underneath the balls. Adding in the light shading here. Because even though this isn't a main shadow, there is quite a lot of darker shading within this ripple of frosting. Going to extend this shadow a little further up. Layering does take quite a long time with coloured pencils, but make sure you're being really nice and patient. Don't rush it at all. You'll get much better results if you take your time as you do this. I'm going to switch over to the dark brown just to shade in the shadows underneath the icing where it's meeting with the cake sponge. I'm not going to bring the shadow too far down yet. I'll work on that when I'm doing the cake sponge. Okay, that will do. Now let's start to go back in with our pink rose. And I'm going to layer this everywhere but the brightest highlights. There is a small, very subtle ball here that I'm just going to sketch out. Again, shading over some of these lighter shadows. So remember, it's only the brightest highlights that we're not shading in. There's a lot of white on this section of frosting. So I'm going to leave this upper part free of any pink rose here. Then we've got a bit of shading at the top, and then once again it's very light down here. Now I'm going to go in with the carmine red and repeat the same process, going over the shadows, looking back and forth between my reference and my drawing and looking at where this colour is the most prominent. If you get any coloured pencil where you don't want it to, you can try and lift it a bit with the kneaded eraser. Easing in and out of the carmine red. With some shadows, the carmine red comes further down and across than others. For example, in this section, it's not just right by the shadow, it comes further down and down the side of this frosting into this little groove. It depends how harsh the shadow is. Where it's a bit more harsh, the carmine red is a bit thinner. And then where it's more of a diffuse shadow, then you'll need more of the carmine red, so it travels further across. Adding a little bit of the carmine red to this section. I don't want to add too much. And now once again I'm going to go back in with the Tuscan red, and we're just going to be in a second building up the shadows a bit more. Just quickly switching back over to the carmine just to do this little section. Looking around, seeing if there's any areas that I've missed out. Okay, so now I'm looking to see where needs to be darker. I'm just going in with my Tuscan red with a little more pressure to do this, but again, you don't need too much pressure because it will get darker when we add the solvent. There's quite a lot of dark shadows down here, so I might need to get the brown and the black again to get in those shadows. Once again, looking around, keep looking around at each section just to check whether you've added in enough shading, whether you're happy with everything. You can always add more shading once we've blended it out if you notice anything needs to be tweaked. Okay, so now I'm going to work on the little balls. I'm going to start off by just outlining them a bit more at the bottom, adding in that little bit of shadow using the Tuscan red. Anywhere that needs to go a bit darker. I'm then going to use the French grey to add the shadows to the bottom half of the balls. And on this one coming up the side, bottom, and on the right hand side. Same with this one around the bottom and the right hand side. And the same with this one. Now I'm going to switch over to the pink and just go over those shadows with a little bit of the pink. And then I'm just going to go in with the Tuscan red. Just go around it a bit more just to make them stand out a bit more. Just intensify the shadows at the bottom of them. But when you're adding the shadows around the balls, it can't look like you're just outlining the balls, so you've got to fade away those shadows into the rest of the frosting. Now I'm going to go in with the white, and I'm going to start to layer the white throughout all of the areas that we didn't add the pink rose to, throughout all of these highlights, so that when we use the solvent there's still some pigment down on these highlighted areas, otherwise it won't blend properly. So just lightly layer the white all over those highlighted areas and on any parts of the balls that we didn't add any coloured pencil to. Can even add a little bit of it to the cherry. Okay, now we can move further down and we can work on to doing the cake sponge. We're going to start off by layering our yellow ochre all over the base of the cake, all over where that cake sponge is, being nice and light with this pencil. I'm just going to lift up the sketch outline from the sides, being very light as I do this, holding my pencil nice and far back. I'm not going to go in between these little grooves of the paper, the little folds, because they are very dark, so I'll just be using the dark brown to do them. Now I'm going to switch over to the sienna brown and I'm going to start to shade in where all of the shadows are. So most of the shadows are on the right hand side, so we're going to fill in this section first. Remember to keep everything nice and light, and mainly this middle section is quite light, but then at the bottom we've got that shadow. Some of it comes up a bit further, particularly in the centre of the cake sponge. You can go over where we've added the shadows underneath the pink frosting to help transition it into the highlights of the cake sponge. Adding another layer of the sienna brown at the bottom half of the cake sponge. And now I'm going to switch over to using the dark brown, and I'm going to get in the shadows between all of these little grooves of the paper, being careful to outline them first so that we've got a really nice clean edge before filling them in with a little bit of pressure. So I'm just going to fill them in first. Be very careful as you do this. Again, if you get any coloured pencil where you don't want it to be, just use the kneaded eraser. Now I'm going to fill them in a bit more and bring that shading higher up to transition it into the rest of the cake. So it's a softer transition. Again, applying a lot more pressure where the shadow's the darkest and then easing out. And I'm adding a lot more of the darker shading on the right now, using the dark brown to really darken up the sponge. I'm going to add the yellow ochre now, once again, all over the sponge. And I'm going to add a few more layers of the sienna brown to help tie that dark brown in with the yellow even more. Add a bit more yellow. Going to shade a bit more dark brown. And I'm going to go in with the dark brown and just add some shading to the darkest parts of the frosting. Okay, so I'm just looking around the cake base, seeing if I need to add any more shading. Yeah, I'm going to mix in a little bit of sienna brown further into the dark brown. And I do want to go in with a bit of black, and I'm just going to add that right at the bottom around these cake folds for the casing. Now I'm going to add some of the black just under the frosting to darken up the shadows. So I'm just going to clean up the edge of the casing. It's very important that we've got a nice crisp edge. We don't want these edges to be fuzzy. Now let's start to work on the cake casing. So for this we are using the magenta, processed red, and we are using dark purple. So I've got the processed red, got the magenta, and the dark purple. I'm going to start off by using the dark purple to get in the shadows, and then I'm going to be layering the processed red over the top. Let's start by going in with a kneaded eraser and just tapping on the sketch outline, particularly on the sides, not so much in the middle because that's where we're going to be applying the shadowed colour anyway, but around the sides where that's going to be lighter. Okay, now let's go in with the dark purple, and in the sketch outline where we've done those lines, that is where I'm going to be shading the dark purple. And you can see that each of the shadows is between the two curves. So we've got the two curves and then the shadows in the middle of those two curves. So on the side, when you look at the side, it looks like the shadow is at the tip of the folds. As you can see here, the lines then gradually become in between the two curves as we get towards the middle, and then again it's at the tip of the curve as we get further away. So I'm looking at the reference and I'm seeing how dark that shadow is. They tend to be darker in the middle here and thicker, and then get a bit more subtle over on the sides. So I'm just going to shade straight down first. Then I'm going to look to see if I need to expand it. So I'm going to do a dark line right where the darkest part of the shadow is. And then I'm going to get lighter and lighter as we ease away. Remember, the case doesn't have to look exactly like the reference. You can do it a completely different colour if you want. It's just important to focus on the shadows and where the highlights are. But you could change all of the colours in this piece if you wanted to. Let's move to further to the centre now. Again, let's draw a harsher line right in the centre. So let's draw quite a dark line for all of these. And further down, let's carry on those lines. We might as well go further across and repeat the process. Just adding in these dark lines to start off with, these really harsh outlines. And let's go now and make them look realistic. So we can see here that the shadow is actually extending further to the left, easing off. And then we can meet it the other side, again easing off. And I'm going to repeat that process throughout each of the folds. So basically there's a light bit of shading either side of this main harsh line. So we ease out of it this side, and then we ease out of it the next side. Then the highlight is in the middle part of the fold, so where the curve goes the lowest, under that's where we've got the highlight. So get lighter and lighter as we approach the bottom of that curve, then leave that thin highlight there. Again, getting lighter and lighter. And we're going to repeat that process further down. So also the bow is casting a light bit of shadow onto the casing, so I'm just going to add a little bit of shadow right behind the bow. And the shadow continues underneath the bow. So this ribbon is casting a shadow all the way along this section. So let's just add a bit of shading. For that bow, it's like a stripe all the way down, just like that. And it creates a little bit of shadow just under this ribbon on this side, but nowhere near as thick. And I'm going to darken up the shadow right by the bow. So it's darkest right by the bow and then gets lighter. Okay, moving back onto these little sections, and we've got in the lines. So now we can darken up, add the shading either side of them. Just going to shade the bottom of the casing. And because the folds get less sort of harsh here, they smooth out. You can see that the shadows start to smooth out towards the bottom and they curve around. So just look closely at the reference and follow what you can see. Again, I'm just going to intensify the shadow and intensify the center of the fold. I'm now going to move on to this side. Repeat the same process. Now when it starts to become sideways, you don't have shadows on both sides because the lowest point of the curve is here. So the highlight is directly under that. So we're only going to have shadows on this side, not where the curve gets really deep, if that makes sense. So the shadows are only going to be either side of this dip, and because we can't see the other side of this dip, there's only shadows on one side. And now the whole of this section is quite shadowed, so I'm going to add a light layer of purple all over this area. And also there's quite a bit of shadow above the bow. So we can see these harsh curved shadows. So we've got to get them in, just following the curves of each section. I'm going to darken up these folds. Let's darken this up a bit more. Now I'm just looking around the cake case to see if I've missed anything, to see if the shadows look correct. Just going to thicken up the shadows down here. You need to get darker in this corner. Just keep looking between your drawing and the reference until you're happy with how it looks. Obviously it's looking very purple at the moment, so we'll need to layer in that processed red, that pink tone. And I am actually going to go in with an eraser, my Tombow Mono eraser. And I am going to use this to add in a bit of highlight. So I didn't include this in my materials list because I wasn't expecting on using this. But if you ever get any coloured pencil in an area where you don't want it to be, then you can go in with an eraser and just simply lift it up just like you would normally. So if any areas it's meant to be highlighted but you've added in too much coloured pencil, this will lift it up a bit. It won't lift all of the coloured pencil up, but it's good just for lifting up a bit of it. And then I'm going to go in with the processed red and just layer this on top. Very lightly over the whole thing. carefully going around the bow, and we're going to layer this especially over the top of those shadows so that it mixes in with the purple and makes a nice shadowed colour while still making the casing look a bright pink tone. So first layer this all over the casing, and then add more layers where the shadows are. Once again, layering it all over the shadows. And finally doing the same on this side, layering it all over, and then even more where the shadows are. Leaving where the highlights are with only a little bit of this processed red. Okay, you can switch back over to the purple and darken up the shadows even more where you need to. There we go, just intensifying the shadows, darkening them up. I'm going with a little bit of black, just for the darkest parts, for the darkest shadows. Just add a little bit of black. And I'm going to go in with the magenta and layer some of this magenta over the top of the shadows as well. Cleaning up the edge around the bow. Also, we need to darken up the shadows for this section here. So I'm just going to go in with my black and just darken them up a little bit. Okay, and finally we need to work on the bow. So I'm just going to wipe away all of the bits And we're going to go in firstly. I'm going to do a layer of the turquoise blue. I'm looking to see if I'll need to remove or lighten any of the sketch. Actually, no. Let's stick to what we've been doing. Stick to the same method and get in the shadows first. So let's go in with our 70% warm grey and use this to shade in the shadows first. Then we can go over it and tie it all in together with the light aqua. So inside the bow, we've got a bit of shadow here. It's darkest right by the bow, then eases out. Again, keep everything nice and light. Even where the shadows are the darkest, because if we need to, we can add a bit of black. So the darkest parts is in the center of the bow here. Got this subtle shadow right here, so I'm just going to lightly shade that in. When I want to make my shading even lighter, I hold my pencil even further back so that we can get lighter shading. So the lighter I need the shadow to be, the further we hold it back, because it really restricts the pressure that can get to the tip of the pencil, so everything naturally becomes a lot lighter. There's also this shadow underneath the bow and by the cupcake that I'm going to lightly shade in with the grey. Let's clean up the edge of the bow and darken up the shadow closest to the bow, and then it's got lighter as we diffuse the shadow further away. So if we start to work on the left hand side, this section of the ribbon and this part are quite dark, so we do need to layer a bit of the grey all over this section, holding the pencil nice and far back as we start to layer this. Adding a base layer to the whole section first, and then I'm looking at it and I'm identifying where the darkest parts are. So there's a bit of shadow just above the bow between those folds, and also it's darkest in the inner corner where we're meeting the other sections, and the other sections of the bow are casting a shadow downwards, and also on this side. Bring the shadow further up, and this part's quite dark, and once again it eases out very quickly. Got a little shadow up here, and then I'm going to look down at this section, this part of the ribbon, So we've got a small shadow at the top of the ribbon by this darkest shadow as well, so just above that. Then also at the bottom. So I'm lightly going over the bottom of the ribbon. I'm going to pull that up, that shadow up further towards the middle. And it isn't too dark, so we don't need to add too much shading. I'm also looking for the subtle shadows and subtle folds. Now we're going to move over to this ribbon. There's a shadow going horizontally across. The centre between these two ribbons is a little bit darker than the ribbon, so I'm adding a layer of the grey all over. And this section is quite dark as well, so I'm going to add a base layer of the grey over the whole of this section first. And now I'm focusing on where it's the darkest, which is on the inner corner, just like on this side. And I'm going to add more layers there. It's also quite dark on the other side. It's more highlighted in the middle here. So again, applying more pressure and then easing off as we get towards that middle area where it's lighter. Okay, now that we've got in all of the shadows, we can add the light aqua over the top. I'm just adding a bit more shading, darkening up areas that I think need to go a little bit darker. But now I'm going to switch over to that light aqua, and I'm going to add this everywhere but the lightest areas. So there's some areas where I just want to add white. And I'm layering it over the top of the grey as well. To help tie the blue into the grey so it just looks like dark blue shading. I'm going to add a little more grey. If I notice that I need to go darker, I'm going to add the grey straight away and add the blue over the top. I'm going to add a bit more grey here and go over with the light aqua. I'm going to keep layering the light aqua where it's the most saturated to make the bow really nice and bright and vibrant. Only missing out the brightest areas. Keeping my pressure nice and light. I'm going to add the light aqua over on this side. Once again, adding a bit more grey inside of the bow. Creating a nice clean edge on the bow. And keep building up more shadows where I need to. Now that I've added in all of the light aqua, I can see where I need to darken up. Don't want to add too much coloured pencil, because if you have too much pigment, it again makes it harder to blend with solvent. You don't need too much down. Okay, now I'm going to go in with the white and go over all of those areas that I've left white to make sure there's enough pigment on those sections. I'm also going to add the highlights to the centre of the folds. So now that we've added layers to the whole of the cupcake, we'll need to start blending it out in the next part. But I'm just going to look around the piece and see if I need to darken anything up before we move on to that step and finish this part. So I'm going to add a bit of black to the little straws, to these darker sections of the straws. I'm going to add some dark brown to the cherry as well, to the shadows on the cherry. I feel like the shadows need to go a bit darker. I'm going to go over that with the Crimson Lake to make sure it's a nice red tone. I'm going to add some of the Crimson Lake overlapping onto the highlights at the edges, just to tie those areas in together. Now there is this little ball that I didn't get in properly, that I didn't shade in, so I'm just going to shade in a bit of French grey 10% at the bottom of that. And add a little bit of shadow with the Tuscan red, just at the bottom. But that is it for the layering process, and in the next part we'll be blending all of this out using our solvent. So I'll see you guys in part 3. Bye everybody. Hey patrons, welcome back to the third part of this tutorial series where we are going to be working on blending out our first layer of shading. So in part 1 I went through the materials that I'll be using for this series. In part 2 we went through how to layer the coloured pencils and how to create really nice soft transitions between colours. And now in this third part we are going to be blending using the Zest-It pencil blend solvent. But like I mentioned in part 1, you can also use something like paint thinner or a mineral spirit or even Gam salt or something like that. Or if you're not sure whether you'd like this and you don't want to invest too much money, if you have something like nail polish remover lying around the house, then you can try that. It's not archival, but it'll give you an idea of how solvent performs, and then you can decide whether you want to invest in some proper solvent for coloured pencils. So I did mention that I will be using my filbert brush, which is the Daler Rowney filbert brush size 12, and I will be using cotton buds. But then I realised that I've also got little areas like this, and the cotton bud and the brush are both way too big for those areas. So I've also got this really tiny brush that we'll mainly just be using for this area here and potentially bits of the straw. And this is the Daler Rowney Aquafine Spotter brush. And this is just a really tiny brush for those details. Now the key thing to remember here is that you don't want your brush to be doused in the solvent. You don't want it to be dripping with it when you go in and start to blend. You want to dip your brush into the solvent and then use some tissue to tap off any excess before you go in and start to blend your coloured pencil drawing. So I'm going to be starting with my tiny brush because I'm going to be working from the top to the bottom again, and I'm just going to be dipping it into my pencil blend. Now because this brush is so tiny, we won't need to actually tap off the excess with this one because it's not going to be picking up much anyway because it's so small. But I am going to start to work that solvent throughout the top of the cherry, throughout this stalk. Very carefully blending this out. Just following the stalk down. You may need to dip back into your solvent. And then when we get to the main part of the cherry, we can use our other brush and our cotton buds. There we go, that's all we need to do with this brush. I'm just going to work a bit further up the stalk just to make sure it's fully blended out. And then I'm going to switch over to using a cotton bud for the rest of the cherry. Now this cotton bud is going to pick up a lot more of the solvent, So we'll definitely need to tap off the excess once we've got it onto our cotton buds. So at the moment that's too wet, it's soaking wet. So we'll get our tissue and we'll just tap off all of the excess. You don't need much on your brush or on your cotton bud at all. The littlest bit will work. Otherwise it will start to bleed out further than your drawing and you don't want that. And I'm going to start by blending out the highlighted areas. And then I'll start to blend out the shadows afterwards. So blending the highlights first, and you can see how they have become nice and dark and rich. And now let's start to blend out the shadows. And you'll notice how it gets rid of all of the graininess, really saturates these colours and makes it look really nice and vibrant. And there we go, we've blended out the whole of the cherry now. You can see how much darker it looks. We still need to build up more layers on it, but it looks great at the moment, and we can start to move on to blending out the frosting. For the frosting, I'm actually going to use my brush to show you how I'd use that. Again, I'm just dipping it into my solvent, getting rid of the majority of it, and I'm going to start with the lighter areas and then move on to blending out the more mid-tones. Keep dipping it into your solvent if you think that it's not really blending as much as you want it to. Once it starts to stop blending, you can dip it in the solvent again. But it's better to have too little on your brush than have too much. And if you feel like the brush is a bit too big for this, you can always switch back over to the cotton bud. You just want to blend out all of the graininess. Even the little bit, the littlest bit of solvent will go quite a long way in blending all of this out. Only dip the brush back in when you notice that it's really not blending out anymore. But as this is still working, I'm not going to dip it back in the solvent just yet. You can see how much more vibrant it's looking, how it's darkening up those shadows. And it's starting to look more like a painting than a coloured pencil drawing. We want to get rid of all the graininess, because if we're trying to make something look nice and realistic, we want it to have a realistic texture, and frosting isn't grainy, it's nice and smooth. So you can see how long I've been blending without going back into my solvent this time. And it's still blending everything out really nicely. And you want to have as little solvent on your paper as possible, because you don't want it to smell really strong, which will happen if you douse it with loads of solvent. It's starting to be a bit more difficult to blend out now, so I might have to go in and add a bit more solvent in a minute. I'm going to keep going as long as I can, and I am scrubbing a little bit with my brush. I am applying a bit of pressure, and I am going in circular motions and really trying to blend it out. You do have to work it a bit sometimes, but you don't need to damage your paper at all, so don't press too hard. Let's see if we can do all of the frosting without having to go back in and add more solvent. And what's great about using the solvent technique is that you can go and add a lot of layers on top, and they'll go on just as easy as they did with the first layer. Okay, I have had to dip back into my solvent. Now I'm just carrying on blending it all out. And I'm looking around, seeing if there's any parts of the frosting that are still grainy, but I'm happy with how it's looking. So now we can move on to the next part, which will be these wafer straws. So I'm going to get my Zest It pencil blend, and I need to clean my brush. So I'm getting a bit of it onto my brush, and I'm just going to start to clean the brush off onto the paper, the tissue, dipping it back into the solvent and going over the paper again and again until there's no colour left on there. Okay. Now that I've got the excess off my brush, I can go in and I can tap this over those straws. Might actually be better to use the small brush for this. So I'm going to get my small brush and use that to blend out the darker areas and the sides. Like I said, don't worry if it's not dark enough yet, because it will be once we've added in our final layer. And now we're going to start to move on to the base of the cake sponge. I'm going to use my brush for this, blending over the highlighted area first and then going into the shadows. Blending out the shadows over on this side. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to using my cotton bud to blend out these darker areas in between the casing for the cupcake. So I'm using my cotton bud to do this, getting rid of the excess. I'm just going to tap this on all of those little sections, all of those shadows, and I'm blending upwards into the cake sponge because I don't want to smudge out the pink. Okay, you can also use the cotton bud to blend out the cupcake casing because it's already got the pink on it on the other side. So I didn't dip it into any more solvent. I'm still using what was on there from when we did the cherry. And I'm just blending out the whole of the case just by blending downwards. Making sure again to get rid of all of the graininess. You can blend all of the shadows first if you want to, and then go over the highlights to try and prevent darkening up the highlights too much. But it's okay because we can go over it with the white if we need to. So you can see how I'm blending out all of one colour, all of one area before moving on to another colour, so that we don't have to clean out our brush as much. Our cotton bud, we don't have to blend, we don't have to clean that out as much. Blending out the highlights now. And so now we've done all of the casing, it's just the blue icing left to do. So the blue icing, gosh, what's wrong with me? The blue bow. And to do this, I'm going to use another cotton bud. I'm going to dip it into the solvent. Once again, get rid of the excess on your tissue. And I'm going to first blend out the highlights. So go over all of the highlights first. And then I'm going to start to blend out the midtones. And then lastly blend out the shadows within that section. I think I dabbed off a bit too much solvent, so I'm just going to add a little more. And I'm going to carry on. I'm just going to go throughout the whole of the bow and blend everything out. If we need to add another layer of the bright blue to brighten it up, then we can do that afterwards. So don't worry if it's looking too dark and dull at the moment. We'll fix that in our final layer. I'm just going to use the clean side of the cotton bud now, the other end. I'm just going to finish blending out the rest. Finally, I'm just going to blend over the shadows. These little shadows that we've done under the cupcake and under the bows. Starting at the darkest part of the shadow and then swiping it over to where it's the lightest. And now that we've done everything and everything's blended out, that is it for this part. And in the final part, we're just going to be adding all of the details and finishing this off. But I hope you enjoyed following along with this, and I hope you like how yours is looking so far. You can see how much more vibrant this is now that we've done that simple thing of going in and blending it out with the solvent. There's no graininess anymore, and it just looks so much richer and more like a painting. But we do need to go in, add some highlights, add some texturing and smooth everything out, and also just work on adding in some more shadows. But that's what we'll be doing in the final part. So I am going to leave this now to dry. It does need some time to dry. I'm just going to leave it for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll finish it off. The more solvent you use, the more time it will need to actually finish drying out, but you shouldn't have used too much so it won't take too long. So I'll see you guys in the final part of this series where we'll be finishing off this cupcake study. Bye everybody. Hey patrons, welcome back to the final part of this tutorial series. In the last part we worked on blending out the whole of this cupcake study using solvent, and now that it's dry we can build up our final layers and add in our final details before we call this study finished. So I've waited a bit for this drawing to fully dry, and I'm going to be working from the top to the bottom again, and this sort of stage is just about making sure our shadows are as dark as they need to be, defining anything, so making sure everything is nice and crisp where it needs to be, got good definition to it. We need to add in highlights, and these bright highlights with a gel pen as well, and use the white pencil to add in some more highlights throughout the shiny parts of the cherry. And basically it's just about finishing everything off and making it look as good as it can do. So let's start off with the cherry, and I'm going to be using Tuscan Red and the dark brown to darken up the shadows a bit more, and then I'll be using the white to add in the highlights and the white gel pen to add in the brightest ones. So let's first start off by going in with the Tuscan Red, and I want to see how dark this will get the cherry on its own. And again, you don't need to apply a lot of pressure, it really does go on top of that first layer really easily, which is why I love using solvent so much. It's really easy to layer everything. So I'm going to add a layer of this Tuscan Red to the whole of the cherry, all of the shadowed areas. Being very light as I do this. Want nice crisp edges as it meets with the frosting. I'm going to use the dark brown to darken up some of these shadows even more. I do want to actually add in a layer of the Crimson Lake, lightly going into the highlights. I am going to go in with another layer of magenta, and I'm just going to lay that over the darker highlights. The great thing about solvent is that you can go in, if you want to, and blend over it again. So I'm just using the solvent that's still on that brush, just to smooth out that area. And now I'm going to go in with my white pencil and add in all of the nice bright highlights. So we've got a very bright highlight here. It's important to look at the shapes of the highlights. And we really want to make this cherry look shiny. At the moment it doesn't look very shiny. So we need to make sure we're shading in all of the highlights and getting them in the correct place. There we go, it's looking a lot shinier now. You can go over some of those white highlights with the pink to tone them down a bit if they aren't that harsh in the reference. And you can go over with some of the Crimson Lake as well. You can also use the brush to wipe away any bits. And finally I'm going to finish off the cherry by adding in a couple of the brightest highlights using my white gel pen. I'm going to go back in with the Crimson Lake. Okay, so now let's move on to the frosting. And I'm going to darken up the shadows. So I'm going to go in with my Tuscan Red to start off with, and I'm just going to use this on all of the areas that I want to darken up a bit. You probably won't need to darken up all of the shadows, but there might be a few that you want to make a little bit darker. Or you just want to define a bit more. So I'm just going to go throughout the frosting and add this Tuscan Red to all of those areas that I want to darken up. And then I am going to go over this with that Carmine Red to make them look nice and bright and saturated. Now I'm focusing on just getting the shadows as dark as they need to be. Adding in some of the shadows under the little balls. Okay, nearly finished adding in all of the shadows that I want to. I am going to be going in with that carmine red and go over all of those shadows that I've just darkened up. And you'll probably be able to see with yours how easy these pencils are going on, gliding onto the paper. So let's go in with that carmine red. Let's layer that over those shadows. And also over any areas that I want to make more saturated, like the reference. Keep looking at your reference as well. I'm nearly finished adding all of this carmine red. I also want to add in some white for the highlights, brighten up the highlighted areas. First I'm going to go over any of the pencil that I've just added, any areas that look a bit grainy. I'm just going to go over with the pink rose just to blend that out. We don't want anything to look grainy. And now I'm going to go in with the white and let's start to add in these highlights. So I'm looking throughout every single part of the frosting and identifying the brightest areas. And I'm just going to shade in the white throughout those areas. You can add some whites to the little balls. And you can see how well the white is standing out on top of this first layer because we used the solvent to blend. So it's really important that you get your highlights bright enough, so I'm really pressing down hard to get in the highlights where it looks really bright. Just going to go in with my Tuscan red and just darken up under that highlight. Now there's a lot of highlight here, so I'm really going to press hard to get it nice and bright. It reminds me of drawing flower petals, this does, like drawing a rose. So look at each section, identify the highlights, and then sketch them in using this white pencil. Nearly coming to the end of adding in all of these highlights. You can also use it to clean up any edges so that they're not grainy. Looking around the frosting, seeing if there's anywhere else that I need to brighten up. I'm going to add a little bit of the pink rose over this highlight just so it's more of a gradual transition into the brightest area. Nearly finished adding in these highlights. Just going through the last area. Okay, now we can move on to the next area, which will be these little wafery straws. We haven't done them yet. It's important to keep looking throughout your drawing because you may notice areas that you need to brighten up that you didn't notice before and that you missed. So keep looking through areas that you've finished and check if you need to tweak anything. So I'm going to start off with my dark brown and I'm going to go over those darkest parts of the straws. Making sure to be kept very careful as I do this because they've got to be the right thickness. You can go over it with some black as well to darken them up further. Just go over with a little bit of black, very lightly. Okay, now I'm going to go in with the grey again, the light grey, French grey 10%, just going over the sides. Dragging some of that dark brown as well. We're going to add a little more of the sienna brown. Keep it nice and accurate to the reference. And I'm going to go over once more with the dark brown, once more over those dark areas. And I'm going to wipe away all of the bits. I'm also going to use the white to highlight the centres of the straws. There we go. Once again, we can now move on to the next bit. So with this section, we do need to darken up the edges. So I'm going to be going in with the dark brown and just add another layer over the top, going in circular motions to do this. We do need to darken up all of the shadows, and I want to add a bit more of a cake sort of texture to the sponge. So I'm going to go in with my yellow ochre and go in big circular motions so that the pencil isn't going everywhere. And I'm going to go in with the white and also just go in light circular motions so that it only sticks to certain areas. Just to help give a bit more of a bumpy surface. It isn't too bumpy. You can go in with little dots as well if you really want to give it a bit more of a texture. You can go in with a bit of pressure with the white pencil and then glaze over it with the yellow ochre. There we go. Now before I go over too much with the dark brown, I am going to go in with the black and I'm going to use this underneath the frosting and for these little bits where the sponge is behind the casing, because I want to get in the black first and then we can go over it with brown so it doesn't look like black, it looks like very dark brown. Being very light with this pencil because I don't want it to look too shiny. And again, being a little bit bumpy with it. I'm going to outline it a bit, giving a bit more bump to the sponge, to the edge. go further along. Let's go in between the casing. Remember to be very nice and clean when you outline it. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to the dark brown. Actually, just make sure there's no little holes. Make sure that you've got in everything. Going to go switch over to the dark brown. Just use that over the edge of the black. I'm going to layer it over the top of the black, especially at the edges. So it's a nice even transition, subtle transition into the rest of the cake sponge. And under the frosting, we need to go over with the dark brown over the black. Again, we've got to add texture, give it that bumpy texture. Now I'm going to go in with the sienna brown, and I'm going to use this to add more warmth and create the mid-tone values. So I'm going over where we've added the dark brown, easing it into those highlighted areas. Now I'm going to go in with the yellow. Just use that over the top to make it a lot more vibrant. I'm going to press a little bit harder in the darker areas just to add a few highlights, mainly adding little dots. And you can do the same with the sienna brown. Wipe away all of the bits again. I'm going to use the white to add the highlights to the cake sponge. I'm going to add the yellow over the top, and that's it for the cake sponge. Now we can move on to the casing. I'm going to start off by using the dark purple to go over the shadows and any areas that need to be darker. For example, the shadows from the ribbons and this really dark area over here. So I'm going to work from the left over to the right. I've got my pencil really nice and sharp so that we can get in really defined details. Once again, we want to be darker in the middle and then get lighter and lighter with our pressure either side. Okay, so I'm still just doing the exact same thing, not much else to say. I'm just going over all of those shadows with another layer of the dark purple. I'm also going to go in with the warm grey 70% and just darken up the darkest part of the shadow. And you can use the white to ease out of it. Okay, back to the casing. I'm just going to carry on with that dark purple. I'm also going to go in with the black and darken up the darkest shadows for the casing, mainly the ones being cast by the ribbon and the bow. And I'm going to go in with the Process Red and just go over the sides of the shadows, leaving the middle where we're going to add the white. So going over the shadows and blending towards where the highlight is. Now I'm going to go in with the white and I'm just going to add the highlights in the middle of each of these little folds. Just going to clean up the edge of this fold. Okay, and now finally we'll start to work on the bow. I do just want to go over this shadow, adding a bit more of the warm grey. I'm going to go in with my white pencil and just blend over that shadow. Okay, so now I'm going to start off by adding the light aqua everywhere but the highlights, so everywhere but the highlighted areas, as we'll just be using white on them. But I'm going over all of the darkest areas. You don't need to apply a lot of pressure when you do this. This will help the bow to look brighter. As it is looking a little dull. But we will still need to go in and add in some more shadows. So I'm just going everywhere but the highlights, not doing anything new. Okay, now I'm going to go in my white pencil, but I'm just going to sharpen it first. I'm just using a cheap sharpener to do this, just a normal sharpener. And I'm just going to go over the highlights, blending them into the rest of the blue so that they're nice and soft. I'm even adding the subtle highlights that I can see. Okay, now that we've got in all of the highlights, we can start to get in some of those shadows. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to use the black first, and I'm going to use this to get in the darkest shadows. And this glides over the top of those other layers really nicely. The bow is casting a shadow onto the pink cupcake case. So I'm just going to add that in and blend over it with the processed red at the edges, so it looks nice and subtle. I'm just going to blend over it a little bit with the light aqua. I'm going to use the 70% warm grey just to darken up part of the inside of the bow. Keep going over it with the light aqua. Once again, blending over it with the light aqua. Going to add in a bit of black in this corner. Lightly shading the black. And blending with the light aqua. Blending in circular motions. Adding a bit more black. And keep blending over it. I'm just going to add some shadow on the other side. Going over the light with the light aqua again. Remember, you don't want any harsh lines, so keep everything nice and smooth. I'm going to go back in with the black, add some shading at the bottom of the bow. Now that I've got in all of the shadows and the highlights, I'm just going to wipe away all of the bits and see if I want to tweak anything. Just want to clean up the edges of the bows. Now I'm going to go in with my gel pen. Actually first, I'm just going to add a bit of highlight just to the edges of some of these folds. Just going to sharpen the pencil. Going to keep going around the edges. Cleaning up some of the edges with the black. And like I said, let's just add in a few final highlights using the white gel pen. It's very important, if you want something to look realistic, to look at the shadows that it's creating underneath it. So I'm just shading a little bit of French grade 10% below the whole of the cupcake, just as a base layer for the shadow. I did a few darker streaks and I'm just blending that out again. Okay, so let's go in with the white gel pen. I want to add some highlights to the little balls. So I'm just adding a little bit of highlight. I just want to round it out a bit more. You can also use the white pencil to help you with this. So I'm just going to create a nice outline. Also add a few little dots to give it a little sparkle. add a little bit of highlight to the bow. You may notice things you want to tweak as you do this step. And just adding the look of stitching down the side and tapping it so it's not so harsh. Like I said, I didn't need to do too many highlights. You can also highlight around the edges. But anyway guys, that is it for this drawing and that is it for this tutorial series. I really hope you enjoyed it and learnt something new and it helped you if you're a beginner with coloured pencil. I'm really happy with how this drawing came out and I hope you like yours as well. Let me know if you want to see more tutorial series like this, but thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.